Welcome to Schemers or Dreamers, the role of political advisors. I'm Claire Fox, I'm the director of the Academy of Ideas. When we conceived of doing this session, we thought of Dominic Cummings. In some ways, Dominic Cummings has come in the way that we think about, at the moment, what's going on. Every time anybody says, what are the Tories doing, they say, what's in Dominic's mind? Now, I've got absolutely no idea whether Dominic Cummings is the main thinker behind everything, but it shows you that political advisors are more important, maybe, than at any time. Or is that an absolute myth? Because we also, when we think of Jeremy Corbyn, think of Seamus Milne, but how can we have forgotten Alistair Campbell? And then there was Theresa May with her Ollie Robbins. So one way or another, these figures count. But actually, we're going back even longer than that, because this session is organised in partnership with the Lord Burleigh Foundation, and we're looking at the 500th anniversary of William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, who was one of Elizabeth I's closest confidants. And actually, it's arguable that his seeing off the threat of Mary, Queen of Scots, changed history, and it demonstrates that the history-making power of wielding influence behind the scenes. So we thought that we'd give a broad historic look to the issue of political advisors and also consider their role today, whether they're a malign influence, a positive influence, what influence they have at all. So we've got together a stellar panel of people who are going to muse on this question. It's certainly not a for or against situation. It's a musing over, let's see where we go situation. So we're going to start when we hear from Professor Susan Doran, who is the Senior Research Fellow at Jesus College and at St Benet's Hall at Oxford University. She's our historian, Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and her latest book is Regime Change from Elizabeth I to James I. We're then going to hear from Nick Busvine, who is a consultant at Herminius Holdings. He's also the present Mayor of Sevenoaks Town Council. He's a former diplomat and Foreign and Commonwealth Office advisor. His final posting was in Baghdad, the height of the Iraq War, and he has, over recent years, been advising on foreign policy. We're then going to hear from Maurice Glasman, who is a Labour life peer, Director of the Common Good Foundation, author of Unnecessary Suffering, and Blue Labour founder guru and general troublemaker. We're then going to hear from Jill Rutter, who is Senior Fellow at the Institute of Government, has recently become involved in UK and a Changing Europe, who've been the overall strand partners for this battle over democracy sessions throughout the day. Jill is also a former Director of Strategy and Sustainable Development at DEFRA, has worked at the Treasury, Number 10 Policy Unit, been a press secretary and a private secretary to various aspects of government, so is one of those kind of behind-the-scenes malevolent, malign types who causes all the trouble. So we hope she might show something. And then we've got Robert Salisbury, the Marquess of Salisbury, who is a descendant of Lord Burleigh, William Cecil. So he's the living embodiment of what we're trying to think about. He's a former leader of the House of Lords, a former Lord Privy Seal. It's not often that I, Claire Fox, Director of the Academy of Ideas, have two peers from the Lords on a panel, so I'm delighted to have them from different angles. But what a fabulous panel. Give them a warm welcome, please. Okay, Susan, kick us off, please.
Okay, well, I'm here to give a historical perspective. And the historical perspective I am going to give you relates to Lord Burleigh, though I think when we're thinking in terms of special advisors, the history goes back even earlier. Some of favourites that you maybe know of, for example, Piers Gaveston at the time of Edward II, they were considered special advisors, but they were given the name favourites. By special advisor, I think we mean in general terms, within this historical perspective, those councillors that were seen as having an intimate relationship, and I mean intimate, not sexual, with the monarchy or the ruler, and consequently enjoyed a dominant influence on policy making and patronage. Now, as today, there was considerable hostility to special advisors.
Sorry, could we just, sorry, I'm being very rude. Could we have the sound go up and can you shout slightly louder?
Sure.
Combination of those two things. Good. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Can you hear me? No. Okay.
Is that better?
All right. Okay. Can I start again?
Yeah, start again.
Can you hear
Go
me?
on, go on.
All right. So I was saying that special advisors have a long history. They go back even earlier than Lord Burghley. They can be seen in the Middle Ages with Piers Gaveston as the special advisor or favourite of Edward II. And you know what a bad end Piers Gaveston came to. Now, Lord Burghley didn't come to a bad end. He died in his bed. He was much lauded. But nevertheless, during his lifetime, there was considerable polemic and satire about him as a special advisor. They didn't call him a spad. They called him an evil counsellor. And the objections to him were on really three grounds. First of all, there were those people who were angry that he didn't give them the kind of patronage that they desired. There were others who felt that he had too much power. In fact, during his lifetime, England was called in one pamphlet a regnum Sicilium, which means Cecil's kingdom, not Elizabeth's. And thirdly, they disagreed with his politics. And those particularly who disagreed with his politics were Catholics. And there was a considerable amount of writings of all genres against Lord Burghley, Elizabeth's chief minister, who was her chief minister from 1558 until his death in 1598. So it was a long time. And the writings against him could be the famous poet laureate Edmund Spenser, who compared him to a fox, who allegorized him as a wily fox, a schemer, if you like, and the foe of learning, arch deceiver, and a conspirator against the Commonwealth. And then you have writings by Catholics, such as the Treatise of Treasons, which called him a Machiavel, another word for schemer, evil schemer, who had been the person behind the establishment of Protestantism in England and had been behind, as Claire Fox has suggested, the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. Now, I will suggest that that portrait of Lord Burghley is almost entirely unjustified. And I'll say so on a number of grounds. The first ground is that he was not someone who was only out for himself. He was also not like many political advisors today, not out for a particular party. He saw himself as someone who was working for the whole Commonwealth. He had an ethical point of view. He used to walk around, admittedly this was part of his self-fashioning, but he would walk around with a book written by Cicero, which in English translated as Of Duties. This was a book that was to try and present the ethical dimension to political life and to the role as a counsellor. So Burghley himself saw his role, yes, of course, doing well for his family, and you can see he did very well for his family, doing well in terms of putting forward his own point of view, but he saw that as being fundamental to the good of the Commonwealth. And that was what he promoted first and foremost above all else. And there's another way, too, that we must not think of him as an evil counsellor. Because evil counsellors, as I think we think spads today, are seen as having a monopoly on the thinking and the policies of whoever is in power. And Elizabeth I, as much as she admired Burghley, as much as she trusted Burghley, or as much as she went to him if there was a political problem, she nonetheless took advice from other people herself, and she retained policy-making decisions herself. Yes, he may have manipulated things, such as when he made sure that the signed warrant for the death of Mary Queen of Scots was sent to Fotheringay, and Elizabeth had said it shouldn't go without her express permission. Yes, he manipulated, but nonetheless, he did not control policy. So Burghley, I think, is a special advisor of a very different generation. Of course, it wasn't a democratic society. But I think there are things that we can learn from it. I think that special advisors should learn, even though, quite wrongly, I think, they see that their job is to promote the interests of a political party, that they should recognise that they should be thinking beyond the political party to the good of the Commonwealth, or what we would say our democratic state of Britain. And the second thing to learn from it is that governments, rulers, parliament, prime ministers should not allow special advisors to have too much power, that they should take advice from a range of different points of view, and they should make considered opinions in today's world in cabinet in order to come to a policy-making decision which is in the interest of the whole country.
That was a brilliant start. Thank you very much indeed. Nick, if you give us your thoughts. No, you'll have to, do all that.
Yes, good afternoon. So I'm afraid I'm going to come at this from a completely different angle because I'm a former Foreign Office diplomat, and I'm going to look at the issue, I guess, that's been thrown into relief by the whole Brexit debate about the dividing line between partiality and impartiality. I defer to the wisdom of my fellow panellists. I think Jill in particular, who was right there in the belly of the beast in Treasury and worked in Number 10 and obviously worked, I assume, extremely closely with a number of SPADs, whereas I was the schmuck, really, who ended up in places like Damascus, Maputo, Bogota and Baghdad. And funnily enough, not many SPADs came out to see me, but one did turn up with the Defence Secretary Des Brown in Baghdad in 2007 and helped to lecture some very stony-faced American generals who were taking a number of hundred casualties a month about the remarkable similarity between the slaughter that was going on between the Sunni and Shia around us at the time and the tension between the Catholics and Protestants in some parts of Glasgow. I'm sure they found it very, very helpful. But from my former civil service perspective, I guess I just want to sort of say from where I'm sitting, SPADs are clearly, they're political. Civil servants should be impartial and unpartisan. SPADs, if I understand it correctly, should help keep civil servants pure. SPADs are there to take risks. Risk-averse civil servants are there to brief and offer credible policy implementation options. And my kind of worry is really, the reason I've sort of come out of my local council and sort of retirement is that I sort of find it extraordinary how some of the traditional rules and conventions that used to define how we governed our democratic constitutional arrangements seem to be sort of falling apart in front of our eyes, and that may be, the traditional separation of powers between Parliament, the judiciary, and the executive, about which there's been a lot of debate, and things like the Ben Act, where if Parliament seizes control from the executive, who holds Parliament to account? And more specifically on the judiciary, the issue of political impartiality has come up with a lot of people wondering whether their lordships truly are politically impartial. And I think one of yesterday's speakers, the LSE's Professor Peter Ramsey, recently argued that the judgment comes down to a political interpretation of political events. A friend, a former FCO colleague, almost all my former FCO colleagues are ardent Remainers, put it more succinctly when he texted me immediately after the Supreme Court hearing, "Lady Hale for PM." Meanwhile, in government, is it becoming harder to discern where partial SPADs stop and impartial civil servants begin? Just listening to Claire earlier on, she described Ollie Robbins as a SPAD, and so far as I'm aware, he was on the books as a full-time civil servant and governed by a very different set of rules, which I'll just come on to in a second. But I think that's just indicative of how confusing the whole situation is becoming. Take the position of the Downing Chief's Chief of Staff, Jonathan Powell, position created for him by Tony Blair in 1997, described at the time as almost certainly the most powerful unelected official in the country. And I was reminded the other day by a former cabinet minister that the law had to be changed to allow Jonathan Powell to exert some degree of executive authority over mainstream civil servants. It is also apparently the case that that position can be filled either by a SPAD or by a civil servant. Thus, Jonathan Powell was replaced by Tom Scholar, the same Sir Tom Scholar, who is now the Permanent Secretary at the Treasury. So you'd be forgiven for thinking that within this tight-knit group of key players, it's become increasingly tricky to work out where the line on political impartiality can be drawn. I spent 29 years doing my level best to be an impartial civil servant. I felt very loyal to and committed to that system. If it were up to me, I'd leave it that way. If we want an impartial civil service, it seems to me that SPADs have a genuinely important role to play to help ministers develop, refine, communicate party political proposals to the point where civil servants can define the most effective means to implement them. In other words, SPAD should keep civil servants pure. It's tempting to shrug one's shoulders and say, well, you know, perhaps it doesn't need to be that well defined, but the code that governs the conduct of these two government-paid streams of people are very different. The Civil Service Code still states explicitly that civil servants must not allow your personal political views to determine any advice you give or your actions. The code governing SPADs, on the other hand, says special advisors are a critical part of the team supporting ministers. They add a political dimension to advice and assistance available to ministers while reinforcing the political impartiality of the permanent civil service. It seems to me that SPAD's value isn't just about keeping mainstream civil servants like I was, impartial. They also bring a different culture, something that Professor Doran just touched on. The mainstream civil servant mindset is by and large risk-averse. If too much influence over policy is ceded to risk-averse civil servants, nothing much would ever happen. Politicians are much more risk-tolerant. They have to be, and they need SPADs around them who are natural risk-takers. In a July article this year, the FT claimed that the civil service remains bound to the 19th century Northcote Trevelyan principles, uniformly unpartisan and impartial, fearlessly speaking truth to power. I'm afraid too little truth was spoken to power by ambitious civil servants in the run-up to Iraq. I also worry, and in fact, I also worry that there's such a high degree of consensus, you could call it groupthink, within the civil service that Brexit is a bad thing, that the impartial civil servants has fallen prey to a degree to partisanship. But what would really tip our civil service culture of impartiality over the edge would be if suggestions such as that of Lord Kerslake in August were ever to get traction. Lord Kerslake, who was head of the Home Civil Service between 2012 and 14, proposed during a Radio 4 Today interview that the civil service should bypass the government in order to avoid a no-deal Brexit. He also spoke to The Guardian's Polly Toynbee, who quoted him as saying, "We are reaching the point where the civil service must consider putting its stewardship of the country ahead of service to the government of the day." So I suppose what I'm trying to say is, there we have it. To a degree, and this is down to Brexit, our parliamentary, judicial and civil service conventions are either breaking down or under attack, and we need to pay close attention.
Thank you very much. Fantastically interesting thesis, that, Nick. I'm sure plenty of people will... Plenty to think about, lots to disagree with and agree with. But anyway, Maurice.
Thank you. So I think essentially just to follow up on what's been said, that during a time that I call an interregnum or a time of political contestation, this distinction between politics and policy becomes increasingly difficult to make, and things become stranded. So I know we've talked about Lord Burleigh. I mean, in many ways, the most fundamental political advisor was Cromwell, Thomas Cromwell, and with the Reformation and what he called sealing the kingdom of a self-governing commonwealth, there were many different ways. He actually referred to it as something like an empire. And the establishment of the civil service itself, which he initiated, was all towards the end of a self-governing kingdom. This was the idea of eliminating foreign power in the decision-making of the kingdom. So it's one of the great ironies that now the civil service see their role, certainly Lord Kerslake's version, as thwarting the idea of a self-governing commonwealth, that's the idea. And what becomes, Nick, what becomes policy and what becomes politics? So, for example, central to the Cromwell and Burghley conception was not the separation of powers, but the balance of interests. Was the ancient constitution needed to be renewed with all the different components of the polity represented within Parliament? That would mean the monarchy, that would mean the Commons, that would mean within the framework of the House of Lords, the representation of the universities, the representation also of the church, which I'll come back to. So it's just to say that we are living in these extraordinary times where you cannot make the distinctions that can be made in a period of normal politics between the politics of it and the policy. And just to remind everybody that the civil service, in fact, was established as a fundamental political body that could be relied upon to pursue the end of self-government. So just to say that we're in that space, the things to look for, because the civil service, I think Nick said it well, it's not just that it's risk averse, that would be one thing, but you could say the civil service is always a generation behind in adopting the political consensus. So that's why the horror in relation to Brexit is to disrupt entirely what they think they're there for, which is the stable administration of power. So the first thing about political advisors, I would say, or special advisors, is that they should be political, that they should think in terms of power, not of administration, and certainly not exclusively, as was definitely the case in previous periods of just press management. The second aspect is a degree of strategic thinking. Once again, Nick, I've just got back from Iraq and just got back. I spent 2 weeks there. I was interested to see whether there was any degree of follow-up in British policy in relation to Iraq, and the answer was distressingly that there was absolutely none, just to let everybody know that every day growing numbers of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis are coming out onto the street in favour of women's equality, in favour of democracy, anti-corruption, all the things that we said that we invaded the country for, and our presence is precisely non-existing. In fact, it seems as if we're in alliance with the strange motley crew of militias that we helped install. So the second point about the political advisors is that there has to be some conception of strategy, of a priority of objectives, which of course is thwarted if your only idea is the administration of stable policy. So there's a very strong disruptive element there. The third aspect, which is vital for the politics, which I'll come back to in a minute when talking about Cromwell and to a large extent Burghley, is that the political advisor should be thinking about coalitions, how to build a coalition of interest around the politics. This is the vital factor that a procedural or an administrative conception of what politics is, which the civil servants can't conceivably do. And the fourth area, historically, which has always been the central prerogative of the trusted political advisor, is to build a certain relationship with the institutions. That's part of the coalition building, but it's extremely important. So if you look at Cromwell, for example, as an example, and I do think that Burghley completely was continuous with that, many of the institutions that he brought into a coalition and promoted became what we would call the establishment of the or the new ruling class. So, I mean, the first was a consistent policy of promoting maritime trade. This was unbelievably important in all of this, that we would bypass the balance of power in Europe by essentially building up a trading empire. So the establishment, you know, the clue is in the names, you know, the establishment of Maryland. You can date the time of the monarch from that, or from Virginia, the time of the monarch from that. But the building up of the trade with the New World as well as with the Old World in terms of the East India Company was extremely important, and that led to the very strong coalition with the Corporation of the City of London, which is our dubious host today here at the Barbican. The second extremely strong alliance, which was referred to by Susan earlier, which was extremely important, was with this new Protestant Church of England. That there was a very strong role for the church, and then within that there was Cromwell did it, Burghley did it, was a building up of Cambridge University over Oxford in terms of a very strong Protestantism pertaining within that. Oh, I get the message, Claire. And so the whole message of, so the point I'm making here, and I will make one more point before kicking off, is that the role of the political advisor is essentially strategic coalition building in terms of institutions. And the last one, which Susan referenced very well, is if you're a serious political advisor, you've got to be able to take the hate. That one of your key roles is to be the bad guy, and that leaves your boss in a much more ambiguous position in relation to that. I would suggest that Dom Cummings is too keen on taking that role, but what he understands in that is that key strategic political decisions and coalitions. So his argument is clearly that there needs to be a defection of the working class from Labour to the Conservatives in order to win. In order to do that, you're going to have to upset the previous coalition that was behind the Conservative Party and behind New Labour, and that's going to be disruptive. And he's certainly very willing to take the hate. I know that New Labour advisors were less willing to do that. Anyway, so that's my reflection on the role of political advisors.
Thanks, Maurice. I'm sorry to cut people off in terms of time, but actually that does lead very usefully into, I think, some of the things that Jill's going to reflect on, but, well, a little bit.
Right. Yep. I'm going to slightly narrow it down. There are clearly loads of political advice going on, lots of political strategists, political consultants and things like that, people that parties pay for. But I'm actually going to focus down on the people we pay for, and those are the special advisors sitting in government. And I think a key thing to remember about those special advisors is you, I, Claire, we're all paying for them. They are taxpayer funded. Fundamental, and that's a relatively new innovation in the terms of these sorts of things. I'm not sure about Lord Burghley's salary, but I'm talking about the last few decades. Fundamentally, I think political advisors, special advisors, are a good thing from the point of view of a civil service. As Nick has pointed out, they are there in a sense so that civil servants don't have to get into the politics that they find potentially quite uncomfortable. And you really notice it as a civil servant if you have a bad special advisor and you're working for a minister, because you are perforce forced to actually fill some of those vacuums that the useless, lazy, idle, out of sync with your minister SPAD does. It's also a bit of protection. I mean, other Westminster systems like ours have far more special advisors. So if you look at Canada and Australia, you will see that the ministers don't have offices run by civil servants. They sit surrounded by their special advisors. They don't sit with their departments, and there is a much bigger gulf between the ministers and the administration that's run. One of the things that's odd, though, about the British system is how many ministers we have. And this is something that sets us really apart from a lot of those other systems. And one of the really interesting questions is, why do ministers not want advice from those other politicians who are sitting in the departments? If the task is too big for one politician, why are they not taking political advice from those other people? And the real answer is because they don't get to choose them. Those are emphatically not their team. One of the reasons why ministers like special advisors is they are clearly people they choose. It's one of the reasons why actually special advisors are much more effective when they come into government with a minister, particularly if they've bonded with them in opposition, than when there's the sort of 15th person off the CCHQ conveyor belt towards the fag end of an administration, when there isn't that sort of personal bonding. So I think special advisors are a good thing. They can really help lubricate the relationship between ministers and civil servants, make that relationship work better, ensure that ideas that never are going to fly don't get anywhere, and things like that. But Nick read you some bits of the Special Advisor Code. There are other bits of the Special Advisor Code. In particular, they're not supposed to involve themselves publicly in matters of political controversy. And I have to say, I think the notable thing about the Special Advisor Code at the moment is it doesn't seem to me to be being enforced very well. Memo to Sir Mark Sedwill, who, if you don't know who he is the Cabinet Secretary, but it seems to me that we have special advisors playing quite fast and loose with what they are supposed to be doing on the taxpayer pound. But I think there's a further thing we absolutely have to remember, particularly at a time when our media is completely riveted and obsessed by the activities of special advisors, or more notably, one special advisor, the famous Mr. Cummings, is that special advisors have zero intrinsic authority. Special advisors only have any power, authority, say over anyone because the Prime Minister or their minister gives it to him. They have zero other authority. And what we mustn't let the obsession with the activities of special advisors do is allow those ministers to escape scrutiny for the decisions or briefings or whatever that are going out from their advisors. Special advisors are extraordinarily unaccountable in our system. That's because their accountability is through their minister. We mustn't ever forget that. That applies not just to Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings. It applied, I remember speaking to a friend of mine at the Home Office about what Home Office civil servants thought of Theresa May when she was appointed. They said, well, we really quite liked her until we realised that Nick Timothy and Fiona Hill worked for her. And a lot of ministers have this strategy of getting their special advisors to do their dirty work for them. Remember the famous Gordon Brown quote about Damien McBride when he was finally forced to sack him, which was, I take full responsibility, I have sacked the person responsible. If you're really taking full responsibility, Gordon, it should have been you to go. So the usual rule is that when the special advisor becomes the story, the special advisor should go. Even Alistair Campbell, at the end of the day, got to that point. But at the moment, we have a situation where it suits both Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson for people to be totally obsessed with the activities of Dominic Cummings. But whenever you hear anything that's attributed to anonymous number 10 sources, number 10 aides, just delete that and say Boris Johnson. He is the person who is to be held accountable. Special advisors have no independent authority or accountability.
Thanks, Jill. Robert.
Yes, I'm going to try and broaden it out a bit, whereas Jill narrowed it down, but in order to come back to narrowing it down, if I may. This, I do think, is a very important and difficult subject in today's context. All politicians, particularly very senior ones, especially prime ministers, need a political family. It gives them comfort, they can relax, they know that they have loyal people supporting them. But that political family has got to know that it doesn't become the story. The administration which I was associated with was John Major's one, and Jill, you were a very distinguished civil servant at the time, formidable reputation, if I may say so. But I think you would agree with me that whatever John Major's strengths or failings might be, there were a number of people who formed a very powerful political family for him, and it was one of his considerable strengths. And I think it was one of the considerable strengths of that family that that the public didn't know that they existed. Your point. They knew the limits. And the broader context in which I would try and put this is, you may all think a bit of a glimpse of the obvious, you particularly, Claire, if you agree with it. But I go back in a way to what Susan was saying about the 16th century. It's become a cliche to say we live in an age of rapid transformation driven by technology, but I nevertheless think it's absolutely true. And what do periods like this mean? They mean that there is immense and rapid social change. And that social change drives almost invariably disillusionment with existing institutions and essentially the people who run them. People realize that they are at least as clever and as well as informed as the people that they've been brought up to look up to. So it's something that happened, I think, very much in the 16th century. There was a new age, and unless you learnt to live with that new age, to take advantage and make it your servant, you became rather superfluous. You became rather like the Spanish Empire, which failed to do that. It took us rather a long time and a good deal of spilt blood, but we got there in the end for a bit. So I do think that the age which saw the introduction of printing in the late 15th and the 16th century and its effects had an immense effect on political structures and in overthrowing what clearly had come to be seen as rather flat-footed and incompetent. The present technological revolution, when you think about the effect of, just take two examples, genetics and whatever quantum computers are going to deliver to us over the next 30 or 50 years, is at least as great, but it's certainly even more rapid. And in that context, it does mean, it seems to me, that our existing methods of government, however admirable for instance, the Northcote Trevelyan civil service was, find it very, very difficult to cope with this new age. This is true of civil servants, it's true of politicians, and it's true of anybody who's interested in politics. And I think the default position, my colleagues on the panel may disagree, but I think the default position of Whitehall has been, if there's a problem, centralize it. And the result is that more and more Whitehall takes on responsibility for more and more, and as a result it becomes overloaded, particularly in this 24-hour news cycle, social media, all the rest of it. More and more is done less and less well. Whereas if we took an entirely different view and said, let Whitehall do less and less, there'd be a greater opportunity to do less and less far better. And that seems to me to be very much consonant with the spirit of the age. The spirit of the age is surely much more bottom-up than top-down. We hope that the technological revolution, and I suspect this is going to be one of the great fights in the part of the world where, with a dying Europe, 90% of economic growth is going to come from east of Suez, that the new technology will become our servants rather than the instrument of repression of the Chinese secret policeman, which is the alternative. So if we are going to take advantage of this new technology in the way that this country did eventually as a result of the technological revolution of the 16th century, I do think we need to look at the way we govern ourselves, and we need to devolve ourselves much more down and see that that decisions as much as possible must come from below rather than being posed from above. It's, if you like, something which is much more consonant, I would feel, with our own traditions of representative government, however much they may need reform today, rather than the top-down Napoleonic traditions of continental Europe. But it also means, of course, that we are going to have to ensure that the methods of government that Whitehall, or whatever follows it, puts in position are methods which can make people feel not only that government is their servant, but also that they have the legitimacy which only comes from consent. And that consent cannot be given by anybody but the people they elect to represent them. The civil service, I strongly agree with what you said, Nick, I think, is that it is not naturally a risk-taking body, but what it does do is if there is a vacuum at the centre, whether it's a weak minister or whatever the reason, that vacuum it will fill in order for the government to carry on. And that in the end leads you, if I may finish on this point, not to innovation and coping with the new world, but to a form of Austro-Hungarian government. And we know what happened to that regime.
God, I love politics. The hereditary peer argues for a bottom-up, revolution, more democratic than most of the elected people. There you go. Well done, Robert. I like that. Anyway, absolutely brilliant presentation.
When you were a communist.
Exactly. It just shows you where we both end up. That's good. Actually, brilliant presentations from the panellists, in all seriousness, covering so much. So I'm just going to go straight out to the audience. We've got it all here. And one of the things I just wanted to ask you was that sense of, is it just cheap jokes to say people like, whether it was Ollie Robbins correctly identified as a civil servant, but nonetheless people saying he was the one who was making the decisions, or whether it's Dominic Cummings today, there's a lot of they're not accountable, bitterness and all the rest of it. But it would be ridiculous to suggest that there could be a political group without civil servants or SPADs or advisors. So is that just kind of cheap populist nonsense as well? And what do we do about accountability? So over to you, anything you want. And of course, the history is fascinating if you want to ask anything on that. Okay, where are my microphones? Okay, this gentleman here to start, and I'll work my way up.
Thank you. Mr. Busvine, you stated that the civil service generally is less risk-averse and so on. And you talked about how it's opposed to Brexit and that stuff. Wouldn't it be logical that and right for civil service to, as a Brexiteer, still be slightly towards Remain, because that is the less risk-averse kind of approach to policy, whereas the SPADs within 10 Downing Street, especially under Boris Johnson, being maybe more pro-Brexit inclined, because that is the more questionable kind of policy, the more risky policies to take, and that is just a natural continuation of the job that they have.
Okay, thank you, sir. I'm taking a group of points and questions so that people can just reflect on whatever. One of the things is there's quite a big echo on the sound, we've all noticed, but also when you're speaking, you don't have to entirely have the microphone close, because there was just a little echo on what you were saying. That gentleman there has obviously got his hand up.
Thank you all. My question is also immediately to Mr. Busvine, but for all of you. I worked in customs and excise at the turn of the century. I saw the disasters that happened there through mismanagement and how people had to be parachuted in to rescue it. The person who came to my unit is now the head of MI5, and by heavens did he go a very long way to sorting out the serious problems. My question follows from that about conduct and accountability. Do we need a new Civil Service Act and a revised Civil Service Code of Conduct in order to address the situation, or at least go a long way, of conflicts of interest between civil servants and SPADs? One of the things that perhaps wasn't put sufficiently explicitly in the Code of Conduct, because this was a major problem in the issues we had, was the devastating morale impact of conflicts of interest relating to sexual relationships involving senior managers. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'm also interested in what people think about one of the things that I think it was Maurice mentioned it, or Jill, I can't remember, but is about whether some of these things are, some of the advisors have become, their advice is how to spin and con the public. I mean, that's maybe what we think of as Alistair Campbell's role, allegedly, as I say. But I mean, I'm serious in a way. It's like strategy, or whether they're basically saying, when you go out and talk to the public, can you make sure you don't tell them this, tell them that? Spin has actually been a huge problem. Right, who else? Sorry.
Jill said that special advisors have no intrinsic authority. I just wonder whether they actually do. With the whole point of employing a special advisor is surely that they have some sort of intellectual authority that's lacking in the party of governments and more widely. So whether they're a good thing or a bad thing, why is that? Is there an ideological emptying out of ideas and authority in the parties themselves that necessitates that?
Thank you. Right. Don't smoke. I'm like a public health announcement. I can't catch my breath, sorry. Come on, take over.
Should we answer some questions?
One more there. Sorry, everyone.
I just think it's quite interesting we're talking about two really key democratic principles. One, accountability, and one, impartiality. When we've had the Supreme Court, which is one of the highest democratic institutes that is supposed to exhibit impartiality, kind of completely kind of knock that aside in recent judicial decisions. And then accountability, one of the sort of top institutes is Parliament itself. And what I find quite interesting is that we're not talking enough about the media, I guess, and the media's kind of obsession with Cummings and the impartiality of the civil service, the accountability of the SPADs and all the rest of it, is it's almost like they're acting as a layer through which a sort of almost entirely Remain elite media class are kind of fixated on this instead of actually the kind of really top government institutions that are the ones that people on the ground are kind of feeling frustrated about. So there sort of seems to be an obfuscation, can't say the word, you know what I mean, of accountability and impartiality and where that sits in the democratic system.
Okay, thanks. Nick, do you want to take anything up that's come your way or just that you reflected on?
Right. If I could read my own writing, it would help. Yes, on your point about, the civil service mindset, probably, I think somebody miscomputed because I went to high-risk places, but I would say that civil servants are all about managing processes, providing good policy options, and frankly, protecting their minister, their department, and indeed themselves from the shit hitting the fan, basically. So they are risk controllers. And the problem with Brexit is that it is risky. You know, people have voted, and everyone says, well, you know, they didn't know what they were voting for. There's no plan. What's all that about? And for people who are risk managers, that doesn't really compute very well. And it's very difficult. I think Jill was probably saying something like that recently, so I'll just like that. On customs and excise, yeah, I work very well with, closely with customs excise in places like Bogota and elsewhere, and I remember the culture of customs and excise around the turn of the century, and I remember the bar in the basement of Custom House was quite a place. And yes, Andrew Parker had to get, and a couple of other bigwigs went in to help them. And I think, but that's classic. That's classically what happens in bits of the civil service. If the culture of the institution has slightly got out of keeping or not quite functioning correctly, some heavy-hitting dude will be brought in from elsewhere to take a sort of an outside view and perhaps try to impose best practice. You know, just on your point on the Supreme Court, I mean, I can't imagine for a minute that any of those 11 people on the Supreme Court believe that they are politically politically partisan, and that their decision was in any way influenced by their views about the Brexit debate. But it is extremely concerning to me that the question is even being asked. It never would have been 10 or 20 years ago. Finally, on Robert's point about control, I think Robert has absolutely put his finger on it. I think the trouble is we are going through a period of enormous change. You know, all the talks that have been happening about the rejigging of our establishment and Brexit and the car industry and goodness knows what else that Claire's organised here. You know, if your response is to try and centralise everything and control it, I think it's going to go potentially badly wrong. And you know, I think I'm not an expert on media spads, but I think this element of trying to control the conversation and dictate what people think about things is just a little bit scary, and it can have terrible side effects, as with the Iraq case, for example, Alistair Campbell effectively persecuting Dr. David Kelly to the point where he committed suicide. So, you know, I'm with it's not a natural instinct for people in the heart of government to let go of control and devolve it outwards, but I think Robert's onto an extremely interesting point.
Susan, anything you want to pick up?
I'm not sure I want to pick up on those questions because they were obviously associated with the problems today, but I just want to make a couple of points, picking out something Robert said. The first is that we are living in a time that sounds incredibly familiar to me as a 16th century historian. The conflict over Brexit really does parallel in many ways the conflict between Catholics and Protestants in Elizabethan and Jacobean England. The second thing, as Robert himself said, that there was technological change that was being exploited and was also creating problems. We all know about the problems of Facebook and the problems of Twitter and the like in manipulating public opinion. And the same could be said about what was happening in print, both the censorship of print and the manipulation of print, even by people like Lord Burleigh. The bad news is that the conflicts of the 16th century, I would say it's very, you know, we could draw a line to the Civil War. The good news is it was 60 years down the line. But I think we've got to keep our eye on that because there are really deeply ingrained conflicts about Brexit. I think we all recognise that. And one of the things I think our special advisors should be doing, as our government should be doing, is bringing people together rather than exacerbating those conflicts, particularly in their flagrant abusive use of language, and that's on every side. Because it can end very badly indeed, as my understanding of the past period of confessional conflict has told me.
We've just actually, there's just been a session downstairs on the Civil War, and we organised it because in the debate about Brexit, more and more people will reference the Civil War, and people have said things like, I've never understood how anyone could have a civil war until now. And we thought we'd do a historical look at, we had somebody, a historian, you know, we were talking about it historically, but anyway, that'll just show you where we are, so that was an interesting point. Maurice, anything you want to pick up?
Yeah, it's just to bring sort of Robert's point into relationship to at a time like this where there is no consensus. It's not just about Brexit, it's also about the last 40 to 50 years of economic policy, which has overwhelmingly assumed that markets are superior, that procedural states, regulatory states are the way ahead, that multinational agreements that reinforce those things, and all of them embedded within a concept of technology which transcends borders and essentially cannot be controlled. So that is being challenged. So it makes the civil service, it threatens the integrity of the civil service is in fact only genuinely effective at times of political consensus. That's the point. And so what we have here is a situation where the SPADs become the agents of this new disruptive politics, and that is part of the interregnum that we're living through.
Jill.
Couple of points. I think there is a difficulty for the civil service in dealing with Brexit, because for so many Brexiteers, Brexit is an article of faith. If you looked at Ollie Robbins appearing before the EU Scrutiny Committee, he was asked by somebody called Richard Drax MP, Mr Robbins, but in your heart, do you believe in Brexit? That's not what civil servants do. That is not a question you ought to be asking civil servants. I think it's a real problem, actually. I think the civil service actually mobilised massively to deliver Brexit. It would have helped if we'd had a government that was clearer about what they thought Brexit was, which we didn't. And actually one of the reasons why people find Boris Johnson's government easier to work with than Theresa May's, it does have a clearer idea and a more unified cabinet. Both of those actually are really difficult for civil servants to navigate. But you also want a set of ministers who, if you're there, say you're Ivan Rogers, the departing UK permanent representative at the EU, who's potentially been a very useful person to keep on board because he knows how the EU works. That actually is quite useful input into your conversations, because it's not a thing that many of your special advisors have. Interestingly, Boris Johnson's lead negotiator is a guy called David Frost. He's a special advisor, but he's also an ex-diplomat and has very good EU contacts and very good sort of connections around the EU, and that's been really helpful, as opposed to Theresa May's sort of clean skins approach, where anyone who'd ever had anything to do with the EU was persona non grata by definition. But I think actually there is a difference between actually giving advice like, you know, the EU will approach it like this and it's going to be bloody difficult, actually is what you want your civil servants to be able to say to you. You take that on board and then work with them about how you do something about it. And that actually is what the civil service should be doing. You might call that risk averse, you might call that a useful reality check. I might prefer the latter. I'm absolutely with someone who says, you know, what about special advisors with intellectual authority? But I think the mediatisation of SPADs means that actually the number of special advisors in government who are big political or policy thinkers is actually not very big. There were some people in Tony Blair's first policy unit you might put in that thing who actually sort of drove through reforms. And I think it's a real shame, because actually I think that's where ministers in many ways need the most help, is actually people who have deep and ongoing understanding. One of the things they get frustrated with about their civil servants is actually civil servants change jobs so frequently, they don't actually have really good understandings of the policy areas they're dealing with. So I think it's more useful to have special advisors. You know, you might think your interests are best served by using your special advisor slot with someone who's going to spin the Sundays for you. But actually just think about where you're going to tap in to sort of wider thinking, what's going on outside and stuff like that. And that's actually the sort of political advice that's really helpful. If you're a minister who wants to make a difference, as opposed to a minister who just wants, a good headline or two. Too many ministers just want a good headline or two.
Thank you, Robert.
Yes, I'll be very brief. But I have to confess that Richard Drax was my successor, but too, for the Member of Parliament from Dorset South, and I'm very sorry to hear this story about him. There's a point I would like to make, Claire. I think a lot of what we've heard described today, and certainly what I've tried to say, has led to a lowering in the standing and morale of the civil service. I say this with slight diffidence, having two distinguished civil servants on either side of me, but I think cumulatively, when I look back at the authority that civil servants I occasionally dealt with when I was in the MOD, for instance, like Michael Quinlan, who were formidable persons in their own right and were extraordinarily important in the standing of government. There were a number of them, as you well know, Nick, in the Foreign Office as well, I could name and go on by it. But I think we have to realise that there is an important principle here. If government is to mean anything, it has to have the authority to govern. We've given it that authority by electing our representatives to whom, between elections, theoretically, the government is responsible. But in the end, the government has to have the authority to do difficult things. It's not impossible, as we've seen with riots in London, that the government has to act firmly and quickly. It has to have the authority to do that, and for that you need a government civil service that works. Let me give you an example, if I may, just 2 seconds on this. One of the curious things I've had to do over the last few years is I was supposed to be responsible for organising, you'll remember the Queen's Diamond Jubilee boat procession down the Thames. Well, it's 2 of the most difficult years I've ever spent, I think. But also, before that, various other activities like the 50th anniversary of the Second World War and all that. Well, all good fun. But what I thought was remarkable was I discovered there was a network, both at local government and central government level, which I hadn't really known existed when I was a minister. Well, I was a minister in the first instance. And they kept the wheels of the state running. If you want to make sure that London traffic runs, there is a group which does it, and they're very expert at it, in spite of the amount of time that you spend sitting in traffic jams. It'd be even worse if they weren't there. So I think what is very important to realise is that if government has to have authority, and you have to have a civil service that enables that to work, just on mechanical grounds. And therefore, I think that it was entirely frivolous of Tony Blair to, first of all, appoint a chief of staff who was, I know he had been in the Foreign Office, but who was somebody who was a political appointment and who had authority over civil servants. That muddles the clear line of distinction. And secondly, to do it above all to Alistair Campbell, who was his press secretary, was a political appointment, and who was also given authority over civil servants with disastrous consequences, particularly over Iraq. And that makes it clear that government becomes increasingly what you were talking about, Claire, a servant of spin and short-term political advantage at a time when you want a bias inside Whitehall to think in the long term, when all the bias is against that anyway. You rarely reinforced it. So I do think that the division which Jill quite rightly said should exist between SPADs and civil servants has been very much been a line that has been breached a number of times with disastrous consequences for the quality of government. I'm all for reform, going back to the proposal for a new Civil Service Act. I'm all for looking at how the civil service could be reformed and worked. I suspect it will be associated much more with devolving more powers, both to the three Celtic nations and to the big elephant in the room, England. And I'm going to put in a puff for my constitutional reform group on this, if I may. If you are going to do that, then I think there is an enormous advantage to have a national civil service with basic Northcote Trevelyan duties, and which attracts the highest grade people, which has the nerve and the intellectual self-confidence and the backing and the high morale to make sure that the government and the quality of government is carried on. The Queen's government must be carried on. If it isn't, we have chaos.
Okay, so we've only got time for a few more points, and there's a few hands gone up. One thing I did want to say, I found recently when I'm talking to people, maybe not in the Westminster bubble going around areas of the Northwest, that a phrase which I hate from America, drain the swamp, is raised all the time now, and it's actually often in relation to the civil service or the muddle that there is between the civil service, partiality, advisors and so on, because I agree that not everybody understands the distinction, and that's maybe problematic. It is also the case that shortly after the referendum, I was invited to go and meet some civil servants at the Civil Service Club who basically said that they daren't admit they voted Leave amongst civil servants. So it isn't entirely just, I mean, they told me that. I was shocked. I'm just making the point that they said it, not me. And I make that point because I think the civil service have been affected by the Brexit vote as much as anyone else, it seems to me, or that seems one of the things that seems to have happened, is they've not been immune from some of the things and discussions that have gone on. And Nick's written about this extensively, I think, very interestingly. So, hands in the air again. Okay, well, that gentleman there, because you just happen to be close, and then those two ladies there, yeah.
I was just mainly going to say with the draining the swamp thing, that comes from Nisara, which is made by, what's his name, Harvey Francis Barnard, and he's essentially saying that they want to get rid of fiat currency and go back to like metallic currencies. But yeah, it gets incredibly confusing on that. Also, from say Lord Burghley back in the day, where with what was it? Accountability, where it seems back then you could go quite far. And even if some things went wrong, you still had a lot of space to manoeuvre and fix things. Whereas now, it seems there's so much emphasis on accountability, lots of vision has disappeared, in my opinion, where people are more scared of messing up rather than trying to take their vision the full way. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, yes, so those two ladies there, and then there's somebody at the back, yeah. And then, yeah.
Thank you very much. Going back again to William Cecil Lord Burghley, I think he was in a rather different position in that he was both advisor and politician. But the other thing I think about him, which on Robert's point, is that although it was a highly centralised regime, they understood that the power through the country was in the counties, and Burghley has maps where he's got plotted out all the justices of the peace, all the important people in those counties. So the whole national regime is extremely carefully looked after, and the communication between those local bodies and the central regime was very extensive, and I think that was a very sound methodology.
Okay, that's very interesting, because the North-South divide debate here is obviously important in that context for today. Yes.
Well, just picking up from that point, actually, and looking at what's happening today, I think Robert made a very interesting point about the fact that local government has effectively had its legs cut from under it. And I wonder whether, in fact, that's the reason why we see so much dissatisfaction out there in the country, in parts of the country which people feel they've been left behind. The very fact that government has become so centralised has surely led to this. And actually what we seem to be experiencing here is people surrounding themselves with people who are not so much a sounding board anymore, but an echo chamber. And that is a very risky situation to find ourselves in. I wonder if you would agree with that.
Very interesting. And there's one more. I think there's one. Have you got? Oh, they've got the mic. Yeah. Okay.
So I was just going to ask. I read this article or blog post by Dominic Cummings about how he wants to change the whole civil service and put lots of screens and stuff into Downing Street. And I was going to ask the panel if they think SPADs have more of their own political agenda rather than just helping the person in power.
Yes, very good question. Because actually, Dominic Cummings hasn't organised this session, but you could say that our shaking up of the civil service conclusion is one of the things that he seems to be aiming at. So, final question down here, then panel in whatever order you want, or rather in the same, reverse order to the one that we started with. We'll just get your final thoughts. Yes, sir.
The beating up of civil servants seems to have gone back quite some way. Margaret Thatcher was never deeply fond of them. In fact, I remember she once said to my uncle, who was not a civil servant, "I'm terribly sorry I was rude to you the other day. I thought you were a civil servant."
Just one thing that we haven't talked about, I'm not suggesting the panel have to answer it because there's no time now, but one of the things that's also changed thing, I know that this is something that, Jill, you've been on panels where we talked about it before, is there's also the emergence of a different group of people, which is the evidence-based experts from academia. And I don't entirely know that they've helped. It's not that I don't want their expertise, but they've become a kind of another layer. So when Robert's saying, and I mean, who knows they don't feel, they're not accountable. They certainly feel superior to everyone else. And I don't mean that they don't bring something important to the table, but it's in the era of evidence-based policy, they become yet another group. The reason I mention that is if you go to any policy discussion around Westminster, you've got civil servants, you've got SPADs, and then you've got academics who kind of speak as though what they say is the thing which should be listened to above all else, because they say the evidence shows this, you must do this, and that's supposedly it. And you do think, actually, there is something called politics and contestation that might have to go on. I think that is also an interesting area to keep our eye on moving forward in terms of a certain change in the atmosphere. Okay, so Robert, I actually think that I hope Lord Burley would rather like this because it's quite interesting.
You'd love it.
I'd just like to say that actually I'm really pleased that the Lord Burley 500 commemoration encouraged us to do this because I think it's been a fabulous discussion. But your final thoughts, anyway.
Yes, I do think that there is an important point here underlying a lot of the criticism. That is the standing of our representative institutions. And it's significant, I think, that things that would have been thought to be perfectly normal for Parliament to discuss and adjudicate on are now regularly kicked away by Parliament and by ministers because they don't really have the self-confidence to judge themselves. And who do they turn it on to? A convenient Lord Chief Justice or Court of Appeal judge who's become... So this is becoming the reign of a sort of platonic guardians, which is exactly the opposite of what proper grown-up democracies ought to be. And a lot of that is because so much, part of what you were saying, Claire, I think so much of what public discourse has become is that too many people are frightened of expressing an opinion. And that is extremely dangerous. One other point, if I may. I agree by local government. One of the reasons why local government has been so starved is because of the centralisation I tried to draw attention to before. If we push power of decision-making on many things down from Whitehall, you will find much more effective local government and much more effective people going there. People always say, oh, we will have a postcode lottery. I think that's rather a good thing because it will encourage competition and new ideas in different places which other local government areas can can copy. One other thing, accountability. We all are in favour of accountability, but what you do with it matters. I'm much more attracted not by the blame game, but what the airlines do. Unless you're producing Boeing 737 Maxes, which seems to be an exception to the rule, the airlines don't blame so much as to say what went wrong, how can we learn from it. And I think if we were able to do that much more sensibly, not only would that mean that we'd be a more effective form of government, but we would also be a more unified country instead of blaming each other all the time.
Okay, thanks. Jill?
Just a couple of things. I think there's a real issue with local government because I think people aren't convinced accountability in local government really works. And one of the reasons why there is a sort of impetus to centralise or to take things away from local government, for example, big academy school chains or whatever, funding those separately from local government, is because politicians centrally in Whitehall do think they are at some point answerable for things, and they do feel the need to control. So I think that's one of the big centralising forces. Robert said that he thought people should express opinions. I'm going to say, I think one of the sets of people who have been very unhelpful in expressing opinions have been ex-civil servants who have been too vocal, not on the role of the civil servants in Brexit and stuff like that, but on their views of Brexit. And I know that a lot of the people they've left behind think they have made their task of dealing with potentially sceptical, not Eurosceptical, potentially sceptical ministers a bit harder by being always out there on the airwaves saying those things. I think the last thing on Claire's point about evidence and experts in academia, actually, I think the more people you have participating in policy discussions, actually the better. And if academics have done useful stuff, after all, it's funded by us through the big research councils, let's use that in the policy debate. But I do quite a lot of courses for academics on engaging with government, and one of the things we do is say, you might have what you think is quite good evidence. One, is it any good? Usually it's not. Usually it's too late on answering a different question, or very on the one hand or the other hand. None of these things are very helpful for politicians. But the second thing is we say, actually, it is just one factor in any decision, because actually values matter, politics matters, priorities matter, resources matter. So do not go in and assume that because your evidence says X, that means the policy will automatically follow as night covers day. But I actually want them contributing more to the policy debate, but understanding the role that their sort of evidence can play in that.
Okay, thanks. Maurice?
Yeah, a lot of really interesting things. I just want to pick up on these two questions here about the disintegration of the body politic. This is effectively what's happened. So whereas there was this strengthening the counties, the country hundreds, the JPs, the emergence of the grammar schools and of the charters for self-governing cities, essentially what you've had is a centralisation of power in the state and in the market. These are the parallel, which means effectively that people feel powerless because they are powerless, and there's none. So central to this is a system, to go back to this accountability, a system of accountability, of a democratic accountability that's tied in with the renewal of local institutions with power in, I mean, that refers to banking institutions as well as local political institutions.
Thank you very much. Nick?
I'm not sure if Jill was telling me off there. I'm not sure that as an ex-civil servant I dominate the airwaves in any way, shape or form. I've written 3 articles for briefings for Brexit and don't do Twitter or anything like that. The only reason I am a humble town councillor, currently mayor of Sevenoaks. I believe in local government. I don't get paid any money to do it. I do it because we're a prize-winning town council, and a lot of my former friends would find it really beneath them to even consider engaging in the sort of litter picks and neighbourhood planning stuff that we do. But I agree with Jill that when I saw Ollie Robbins's negotiated deal, I was, I have to say, unfairly perhaps, inclined to think that my teenage daughters could have negotiated a better deal. actually, when you look at the degree to which there was a very, very strong Remain strand within the cabinet, I think you could perfectly plausibly argue that a lot of the civil servants were doing exactly what civil servants should do, which was to implement the political direction coming from above. Just very quickly, I would say on the issue of, I think it is important, in these times of great upheaval, to speak up. If you actually think that our core democratic values system is under stress, and it's not just people who've spoken to Claire. The reason I did is that quite a few civil servants have spoken to me privately that they feel persecuted in their departments because they take the wrong view. On local government, we need to engage. We're about to have a revolution over our neighbourhood plan because central government has told us we can't do it. So there we go.
Good luck.
Yes.
Sorry, well, I was saying before about the similarities between the 16th century. Can you hear me? I talked before about the similarities between the 16th century that I found recognisable in today's world, but I think it's very important to point out some of the differences that are relevant to our discussion. There was no civil service in Elizabethan England. There were no paid bureaucrats who could actually live off their earnings. Everything worked by personal relationships, worked by a whole system of patronage. And in those kinds of ways, someone like Burley had to persuade people to, whether they were JPs or whether they were town corporations, whoever they were, to execute royal orders, to maintain order in the state, to support the policies that the Queen was putting forward. When we talk about the civil service at the national level, they were basically clerks or clerks. And Burley said at one famous moment, "I am no clerk. I am the secretary. I am someone with political power, political interests, and a political agenda." So in that respect, we are looking at two very different worlds, and we shouldn't forget that. But I still make the same point that whether you're a civil servant or whether you are a special advisor, and I think obviously the kind of category that Burley fits into is that kind of blurred of both the political advisor and the one that we think of as being part of the civil service today, in that he was somebody who managed the realm as well as advised the Queen. But whatever you are, I do think it's incredibly important to keep your integrity and not just think about the political power and benefits that your master is working for, but what you think is good for the country.
Okay. Can we thank our panel? Fantastic panel.